She whispered like it was a warning, but the way her eyes lingered told me it was a secret invitation. It was one of those evenings when the rain never really decided if it wanted to pour or just linger. A soft drizzle tapped against the kitchen window of the old townhouse, and the glow from a single overhead light filled the room with a muted warmth. I had been living there only a few weeks, still finding my rhythm, still figuring out my landlady, the woman who both intimidated me and unsettled me in ways I didn't expect. She stood by the counter, sleeves of her cream-colored blouse rolled neatly to her elbows, pouring hot water into 2 cups. Everything about her movements was precise, almost graceful, like she'd spent years learning to hold herself together even when life tried to pull her apart. At 42, she carried an elegance that didn't need decoration. It was in the way she stood, the way her eyes softened when she wasn't trying so hard to appear composed. I leaned against the doorway, pretending I wasn't watching too closely. But when she turned and placed one of the cups in front of me, our hands touched. Just barely, the faintest brush of her fingers against mine. Yet the warmth of her skin seemed to linger far longer than it should have. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She simply met my eyes with a quiet steadiness, like she knew the moment had landed exactly where it was meant to. "Thank you," I said, my voice lower than I intended. She gave a slight nod, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear before sitting across from me at the small wooden table. The room was filled with nothing but the hum of the old refrigerator and the patter of rain outside. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into my palms. But it wasn't the tea that warmed me, it was her presence. The subtle perfume she wore, something faint and floral, clung to the air between us. I realized how aware I was of the distance, or lack of it. Just a narrow table, just 2 cups of tea, just a silence that felt far from empty. And then, almost involuntarily, my mind drifted to the thought I shouldn't entertain, what it would feel like if that brief touch of her fingers had lasted longer, if instead of pulling back, she let them stay against mine. I caught myself, forced the thought away, and took a sip of tea to mask the flicker in my chest. Still, the spark was there. Quiet, unspoken, but alive, and I knew she felt it too. The storm outside had quieted by the time I climbed the narrow staircase to my room. The walls of the old townhouse seemed to hold every sound, the creak of each wooden step, the hush of rain sliding off the gutters, even my own uneven breath. It was late, later than either of us usually stayed awake, and I didn't expect to find her waiting. But halfway up the stairs, I saw her. My landlady, leaning casually against the banister, arms folded, her hair falling loose in a way I'd never seen during the day. She wasn't dressed for company, just a soft gray sweater and dark leggings, yet she looked more striking than any evening gown could have made her. "You're coming in late again," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the dim stairwell. I offered a half smile. Lost track of time. She didn't move aside. Instead, she tilted her head, studying me with those dark, steady eyes that always seemed to see more than I wanted to reveal. The air between us tightened, thick with something unsaid. The stairwell was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. And in that closeness, I could see the faintest curve of amusement tug at her lips. "Your trouble," she whispered, almost as if confiding it to the night rather than accusing me. The word slipped into me like a spark catching dry wood. It wasn't scolding, it was playful, threaded with a kind of reluctant curiosity. For a moment I just stood there, caught between the gravity of her presence and the way the shadows framed her face. "And you love trouble," I replied, my voice low, steady, carrying more weight than I intended. Her lips parted, just slightly, as if to respond, then she closed them again, her breath soft but audible in the quiet. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It pulsed, alive, heavy with an unspoken admission neither of us dared to voice aloud. She finally shifted, brushing past me on the stairs, her shoulder grazing mine. A fleeting touch, but deliberate enough to leave its trace. The faint scent of her perfume followed, mixed with the cool draft from the open window at the landing. By the time I reached my room, my pulse was still uneven. Her words echoed in my mind, not as a warning, but as something far more dangerous, an invitation. And though I told myself to be careful, I couldn't help but smile. Because I knew she was right. I was trouble. But maybe, just maybe, she wanted exactly that. The rain had stopped by the next evening, but the air inside the townhouse carried a kind of stillness, as if the walls themselves were listening. I came downstairs to find the living room dimly lit by a single lamp. She was there already, curled into the corner of the couch, a book in her lap, though I could tell she hadn't turned a page in quite some time. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, keeping my tone soft. She glanced up, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Something like that." She gestured toward the armchair, but I chose the end of the couch instead, close but not too close. The distance was deliberate, enough to keep things safe, but near enough to feel the quiet pull between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was, waited, as though both of us were waiting to see who would break it first. Finally, she closed her book, pressing her hand against the cover as if to steady herself. "I used to sit like this with my husband," she said suddenly, her voice quiet, steady but edged with something raw. "Before everything fell apart." Her honesty caught me off guard. She didn't look at me as she spoke, just kept her eyes on the faint light spilling across the rug. I let the silence stretch, giving her space. "I stayed longer than I should have," she continued, her fingers fidgeting with the book's spine. "Told myself comfort was love. Told myself stability was happiness. But when it ended, it was like I had to relearn who I was." Her vulnerability wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished. It was messy, unguarded, and it made her seem more real than ever. I swallowed, my voice low when I finally replied. "I know what you mean, about losing yourself. I've drifted between things for years, jobs, places, people. Always starting over, never sure if I'm building something or just running from the last thing that failed." When I looked at her, she was watching me now, really watching. And for the first time, I didn't feel like just her tenant. I felt seen. She shifted closer, tucking her legs beneath her, the faintest brush of her knee against my thigh. Neither of us moved away. Instead, we sat in the warmth of that fragile honesty, a silence that no longer felt empty but safe. It wasn't attraction alone that drew us together, it was recognition. A quiet knowing that beneath the years and the differences, we were two people carrying broken pieces, daring to place them gently in each other's presence. The storm rolled back in the next evening, this time with a fiercer edge. Rain hammered the windows, and the wind rattled the old shutters. I had been in my room reading when the lights flickered, then went out altogether. The sudden darkness left the house humming with only the storm's voice. I made my way downstairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. In the living room, I found her already searching through the drawers for matches. Her silhouette, lit only by the glow of lightning outside, looked softer than usual, more vulnerable, as though the darkness stripped away her usual armor. "Power's out," I said gently, though it was obvious. She huffed a quiet laugh, still fumbling with a box of matches. "This house is charming until it reminds me it's older than I am." "Let me," I offered, stepping closer. My fingers brushed hers as I took the small matchbox. Her skin was warm against mine, delicate yet steady, and the contact lingered just a second too long before either of us moved. I struck a match, and the sudden flame lit her face in a soft, golden glow. Shadows danced along her cheekbones, and for a moment, she didn't look like the untouchable landlady who kept careful boundaries. She looked human. Beautifully, achingly human. Together we lit the candles scattered on the mantel and coffee table. As each flame joined the others, the room filled with a hushed glow, warm against the storm thrashing outside. She settled onto the couch, drawing a light throw blanket over her lap, and I sat beside her without needing an invitation. "Thank you," she said after a pause, her voice softer than the rain outside. Her hand found my forearm briefly, resting there as if to anchor herself in the moment. The touch was small, innocent even, but it carried weight. It lingered longer than politeness required, and when she finally withdrew, I felt the absence of it as sharply as the warmth before. We sat together in silence, watching the candle flames flicker. The storm outside seemed distant, irrelevant compared to the storm quietly brewing between us. Her eyes found mine in the soft light, and though neither of us spoke, the air carried the unspoken, something fragile, something growing, something both of us were afraid to name. That night wasn't defined by words. It was defined by nearness, by a match struck in the dark, by a hand that lingered a moment too long, and by the realization that affection, once awakened, is impossible to ignore. The rain had finally passed, leaving the air sharp and cool. The townhouse balcony looked out over the street, the pavement below still glistening under the glow of street lamps. I found her there one evening, wrapped in a light cardigan, arms folded as though holding the chill, or perhaps something heavier inside. "You're awake late again," I said gently as I stepped outside. She gave a faint smile without turning. "Couldn't sleep. The quiet after a storm always unsettles me." I stood beside her, leaning on the railing. The air smelled of wet concrete and earth, and in the distance, the city hummed faintly. She looked smaller than usual against the wide night sky, her shoulders drawn inward as though the weight of her thoughts pressed too hard. After a long silence, she spoke. "You know, people wouldn't understand this." Her voice trembled at the edges, though she tried to keep it steady. "You're young, and she stopped herself, biting down on the rest of the sentence. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it linger, because rushing might break the fragile honesty she was offering. Finally, I reached for my jacket, slipping it from my shoulders and draping it gently over hers. My fingers brushed the curve of her shoulder, a careful, grounding touch. "You care too much," she whispered, but her hand rose to hold the lapel of my jacket close, as if anchoring herself in its warmth. "I don't think caring is something you can ration," I said softly. For a moment, she turned her face toward me, eyes shining faintly in the glow of the streetlights. Vulnerability lay raw there, mixed with longing and fear. The distance between us wasn't measured in years or titles, it was measured in hesitation, in the silent battle between what we wanted and what the world expected. Her breath caught, and she looked away quickly, her voice barely audible. "You don't know what you're stepping into." "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I know what I feel standing here." The words hung in the cool air, neither of us daring to bridge the final gap. She tightened the cardigan around her, my jacket still resting on her shoulders, and I let the silence return. We didn't move closer. We didn't step apart. We simply stood there, side by side, letting the weight of unspoken things settle into the night. And though her words warned of caution, her presence told me something else entirely: she wasn't ready to let me go. The house was quiet the next morning, the kind of silence that feels almost deliberate. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen window in soft golden lines, dust motes drifting lazily in the glow. I hadn't expected to see her awake so early, but there she was, standing at the counter, hair loose and unpolished, wrapped in a pale robe that fell gently against her frame. She looked different in the morning light, not the careful, composed woman she usually showed the world, but someone softer, someone unguarded. "Morning," I said, my voice lower than usual, not wanting to disturb the calm. She looked over her shoulder, and for the briefest moment, her eyes betrayed surprise, as though she hadn't expected me to find her this way. Then, a small smile curved her lips. "You're up early." I shrugged, stepping closer. "Couldn't sleep." The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. She reached up into the cupboard for a plate, standing slightly on her toes. Without thinking, I stepped behind her, steadying the edge of the plate before it slipped from her hands. My fingers covered hers on the porcelain, and for a breathless second, neither of us moved. Her hand was warm beneath mine, her skin smooth yet trembling faintly, as though she felt the same electricity that jolted through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, her thumb brushed lightly over my knuckles, a motion so subtle it might have been accidental. But it wasn't. It lingered. The kitchen, usually filled with the hum of appliances and daily clatter, felt suspended in silence. The only sound was the faint drip of the coffee maker. I caught her gaze when she finally turned her head, and in her eyes, I saw the confession she didn't voice. "This," she whispered, her breath catching as though the word itself carried weight, "is complicated." I didn't let go of her hand. "Maybe. But it feels real." Her lips parted as though to argue, but no words came. Instead, she let the silence speak for her, allowing her thumb to trace one last soft line across my skin before she gently set the plate down. The moment broke, but the meaning did not. Her cheeks held the faintest color, her breath shallow, her body angled toward mine as though gravity itself had betrayed her. In that morning light, with coffee scent curling through the air and our hands finally admitting what our voices wouldn't, I understood something: sometimes confessions don't need words. Sometimes they live in touch, and in the courage to let it linger. The stormy nights and hesitant mornings had stretched into a rhythm I never expected. Each day, the air in that old townhouse seemed a little heavier with the weight of what we weren't saying, what we weren't quite ready to name. But on that evening, something shifted. She was already in the living room when I came downstairs, a soft lamp glowing in the corner, a record playing low, filling the silence with the scratchy hum of an old song. She sat curled into the couch, a blanket draped across her lap, her expression calm but distant, as though her thoughts had wandered far away. "Music?" I asked softly, easing into the room. "Helps me think," she replied, her eyes flicking up to mine. And then, after a pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, "helps me remember I'm still alive." I sat beside her, careful at first, but she didn't shift away. The blanket pooled between us, and after a moment, I adjusted it so it draped over both of us. It was a simple act, practical, even. Yet the warmth of it made my pulse quicken. She leaned back, her shoulder brushing against mine, a subtle press that carried no accident. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The air smelled faintly of her perfume mixed with candle wax, and the quiet hum of the record seemed to cocoon us in a world separate from anyone else's judgment. For a long time, neither of us spoke. And then she whispered, almost as though confessing to herself rather than to me, "I don't know when it happened. When I stopped thinking of you as just a tenant." My chest tightened, and I turned slightly toward her. Maybe it was never that simple. She let out a quiet breath, half laugh, half surrender. Her head lowered until it rested gently against my shoulder. The weight of her was light, but the meaning behind it felt monumental. I could feel the soft rise and fall of her breathing, steady, grounding, real. "You're still trouble," she murmured, the words brushing warmly against my chest. I smiled, though my voice came out softer than I meant. "And you still love trouble." Her hand slipped under the blanket, finding mine. Fingers intertwined slowly, cautiously, as though we were both afraid the moment might dissolve if we moved too quickly. But it didn't dissolve. It deepened, solidified, became something we no longer had to question. The world outside might never understand, the years between us, the roles we played, the rules we bent, but none of that mattered in the stillness of that room. What mattered was the warmth of her head on my shoulder, the quiet squeeze of her hand in mine, the undeniable truth that we had chosen each other despite everything. The record clicked softly as it reached its end, but neither of us moved to change it. We stayed there, wrapped in silence, wrapped in each other. And for the first time, there was no hesitation, no warning, no pretending. There was just us.